A king of England once knelt on a nursery floor in London to play with two little girls. One of them would be almost entirely forgotten by history. That forgotten girl was the daughter of a king's mistress and the grandmother of a queen who reigns today. Her mother was the scandal. Her sister was the legend. She was neither. She was the one nobody watched. So why does every thread of this royal story run through her and no one else? Tonight, the woman history left in the margins. Her name was Sonia Keppel. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Her music, for those who are new here. Crown Files tells the stories of the women who lived beside power. The duchesses and the heiresses. The wives kept in the wings and the mistresses kept in the margins. The women who paid a private price for very public lives. Tonight we tell the story of a woman you have almost certainly never heard of, though you know exactly where she stood. You know her mother. Alice Keppel was the most famous royal mistress of her age, the discreet, dazzling companion of King Edward II, the woman who could make a king happy and a drawing room fall silent when she entered it. And you know her granddaughter. That granddaughter is Queen Camilla, who sits beside King Charles today. Between those two women, the mistress of one king and the wife of another, there was a third, a quiet woman in the middle of the story. Her name was Sonia Keppel. She was born in 1900 into a London townhouse where the flowers arrived by the van load and a king came to tea. She grew up watching her mother recline among the lace pillows while the orchids were banked in cut glass vases, watching the great men of the age arrive and depart, watching the one man her mother lived for, a portly, bearded gentleman the children were told to call Kingy, kneel on the nursery floor to play, while her own father seemed to grow fainter with every year. Sonia would spend a lifetime just outside the frame of her mother's brilliance. Never the beauty, never the scandal, never the one the photographs were taken for. And when history came to write down the Keppel women, it lingered on the mother who charmed a king, and it lingered on the sister who ran away across France for love. And it left the quiet daughter in the margins, the way she had always been left. And yet here is the thread that no one expected. It was not the glamorous mother, and it was not the rebellious sister who carried the Keppel name to the very steps of the throne. It was Sonia. The daughter history skipped is the reason there is a queen at all. Tonight we tell the story of a woman you have almost certainly never heard of, though you know exactly where she stood. That is what we do here at Crown Files. We go back for the women the record left behind, because sometimes to understand a queen, you must first meet the grandmother almost no one talks about. Her life would hold a wedding that nearly collapsed at the altar, a marriage that quietly came undone, a book written in her late 50s to make sense of it all, and a final inheritance passed down through 3 generations of women that no one would have wished on anyone. But it begins in that London house in the last golden years before the world went to war. In the house that revolved entirely around the schedule of a king. Let us begin. The house that revolved around a king number 30, Portman Square. A tall, handsome house in the heart of Edwardian London with a nursery at the top and a drawing room below that seemed to a small child to hold the whole of the glittering world. To understand the house, you have to understand its rhythm. Everything in it, the meals, the flowers, the comings and goings of servants, the very hours the family kept, arranged itself around the visits of one man. He was heavy and genial with a gray beard and a cigar that never quite went out. And the 2 little girls of the house had been taught to call him Kingy. They did not entirely understand who he was. They only knew that when he came the house changed, and that he was in his way wonderfully kind to them. In her memoir written many years later, Sonia would recall one of his favorite games. The King of England would sit on the drawing room floor, with a small girl on either side of him. Take 2 pieces of buttered bread and set them racing down the length of his trouser leg, bets laid in coppers on which slice would reach his shoe first. It is one of the tenderest images we have of Edward VI, an aging monarch kneeling on a carpet, letting children clamber over him while their mother looked on. Their mother. Everything in the house came back to her. Alice Keppel was by every account of the age extraordinary, beautiful in a way people struggled to describe afterward. The chestnut hair, the alabaster skin, the low, warm laugh. But it was not only beauty. It was a kind of atmosphere she carried, a gift for making whoever stood before her feel like the most fortunate person in the room. She had made the future king feel it, and he had never stopped feeling it. For the last 12 years of his life, Alice Keppel was the woman Edward VI loved. For her daughters, that presence was something closer to weather. From my earliest childhood, Sonia wrote, she was invested for me with a brilliant goddess, like quality. She remembered her mother reclining among the lace pillows, chestnut hair loose about her shoulders, the room heavy with the scent of orchids and lilies delivered by horse-drawn van. A goddess, Sonia wrote. One whose pedestal might have been made by Fabergé. You can hear even in the love of that description the distance in it. A goddess is something you worship from below. A goddess is not someone who kneels to your height. And somewhere in that house was a 4th figure, growing quieter by the year. George Keppel, Alice's husband and the father of her children, was a tall, amiable man of good family and very little money. He was fond of his daughters, but in the household that had rearranged itself around a king, he had learned to take up less and less space until he faded almost into the wallpaper of his own home. A visiting Grand Duke once asked him to his face whether he was related to the king's mistress. He is said to have let the insult pass without a word. This was the world the younger daughter was born into on the 24th of May 1900, and from the very beginning she did not quite fit the picture the family wished to present. She was a shy child and a sickly one. Asthmatic, easily frightened, prone to hanging back where her sister rushed forward. There is a small revealing story she told about herself. She bore a striking resemblance, everyone said, to her great-uncle, Admiral Sir Henry Keppel, a tiny weather-beaten old sea dog of a man, one of the last living links to the Navy of Nelson's century. According to her own recollection, when she was about 3 years old, she was dressed up in a miniature version of the old admiral's uniform for the amusement of the grown-ups. The daughter of the most fashionable beauty in England, presented to the drawing room as a joke, a small girl costumed as a wrinkled old sailor because the likeness got a laugh. It is a tiny thing, but it tells you the role that had been assigned to her before she could even speak. Her sister was the beauty in the making. She was the funny one, the odd one, the one who looked like the ancient uncle, not the picture, the comic relief at the edge of it. The privilege, though, was total. Summers were spent at great country houses, chief among them Critchell, the vast estate of Lord and Lady Allington in Dorset. And here the young Sonia learned the precise choreography of a child's place in that world. The children were kept upstairs and out of the way for most of the day, but each afternoon after the grown-ups' luncheon, they were brought down, scrubbed, brushed, and rehearsed, to shake the hands of the important guests, to be admired for a moment or two, perhaps to perform some small charm, and then to be sent back up to the nursery before they could become tiresome. Diana Suhami, whose biography traces these women with unusual care, put it plainly, to a mother like Alice, Children were a kind of convenient social currency, something to be produced at tea time to delight a visitor, and then withdrawn. Not the center of the household, the ornament of it. And here is where a small girl learned the shape her life would take. Picture the drawing room in full flower. The king on the carpet, the mother radiant among her guests, the laughter and the candlelight. Now find the child. Not in the middle of it, at the edge of it. Standing in the nursery doorway, or just inside the drawing room door. Watching the brightness she was born beside, but never quite placed within. That is where Sonia Keppel lived, at the edge of the frame. It was not an unhappy childhood exactly. She adored her mother helplessly, the way you adore something you cannot reach. But adoration at a distance is a lonely apprenticeship. And there was another girl, in the nursery, who made the distance feel wider still. Her elder sister was already becoming someone. Vivid, clever, precocious, impossible to ignore. The sister who drew every eye, and who, Sonia would later admit, did not always trouble to be kind to the quiet one at her side. The mother was unreachable. Now the sister was pulling ahead, and the small girl at the edge of the frame was about to learn that in this family there was more than one bright she would spend her life standing just outside of, and that the golden world which framed them all was far more fragile than it looked. The other bright light had a name, and it was Violet. Two sisters. One shadow, she was 6 years older, and from the beginning she was everything her younger sister was not. Where Sonia was shy, Violet was fearless. Where Sonia faded into the wallpaper, Violet performed. She had inherited something of their mother's gift for occupying the center of any room. The wit, the daring, the certainty that the world had been arranged for her attention. Guests who barely noticed the quiet child at the edge of the party remembered Violet for years, and Violet knew it. She was not, by her sister's own gentle account, always kind about it. There is a sentence the two of them seem to have agreed on, spoken first by Violet, though Sonia never argued with it. Measuring themselves against the woman who had made a king abandon his dignity to play on a nursery floor, they concluded, "We are not as lovable or as good looking or as successful as our mother. We do not equal, still less surpass her. We make do and mend. Make do and mend." It is a small worn phrase, the language of thrift, of patching what you already have because you will not be given better. Two daughters of one of the richest households in Edwardian England, describing their own lives in the vocabulary of a seamstress. That is what it does to a child to be raised beside a brilliance she is told she can never match. It teaches her to expect the second best and to be grateful for it. Then quite suddenly, the golden world ended. In the spring of 1910, the old king fell gravely ill. What happened next has passed into legend. And though we should hold the details lightly, the shape of it is well attested. As Edward lay dying, Alice Keppel was summoned to his bedside, an extraordinary thing for a mistress to be called to a king's deathbed with the queen in the house. Queen Alexandra, who had endured her husband's affair for years with a wounded dignity, is said to have permitted Alice a final audience while the king still knew her. But when he lost consciousness, the welcome ended, and Alice was led away in considerable distress. Whatever passed between those women in that room, it was the last time Alice Keppel would ever stand close to the source of all her power. The king died in May. For most of Britain, it was a moment of national mourning. For the household at Portman Square, it was something closer to an eviction. The source of the family's standing, its invitations, its very place in society was gone. Alice Keppel had been the discreet companion of a reigning monarch. She was now the widow of no one. A private woman with a scandalous past, and a court that no longer wished to see her. The Keppels closed up the London house and left the country. For 2 years they wandered. Ceylon, China, the courts and hill stations of the Far East. A family in a kind of gilded exile, waiting for the whispers at home to soften. Sonia was 10 years old, and the only world she had ever known had simply dissolved around her. She would remember the strangeness of those traveling years. The heat, the ships, the endless unfamiliar rooms. The sense of a family carrying its diminished grandeur from port to port, with nowhere it truly belonged. They came back to a Britain sliding toward war, and the war, when it came, did what wars do to the children of great houses. Alice, ever practical, threw herself into running a hospital for wounded soldiers in France. The kind of vigorous usefulness that suited her. But for her younger daughter, coming of age, the war arrived as a long roll call of loss. The young men Sonia had danced with, the brothers of her friends, the cousins and the suitors, many of them did not come home. She would remember those years in her memoir less as history than as a series of absences. Names read aloud, chairs left empty, a generation thinning around her before she was fully grown. Through all of it, the two sisters moved in opposite directions. Violet was becoming dangerous. As a girl, she had formed an intense attachment to another clever, restless child named Vita Sackville, West. And as the two grew into women, that attachment became the central, consuming fact of Violet's life. It was a love that ran directly against every law and convention of the age. And Violet, unlike her endlessly discreet mother, had no talent for hiding what she felt. The affair would eventually pull her across the channel. In and out of a marriage she despised, into elopements and pursuits and scenes that scorched the edges of her social world and gave the gossips of 2 countries something to feed on for years. Violet chose fire. She would spend her life burning against every rule she had been handed. Sonia chose the other thing. She chose to be good. If the elder sister's answer to their mother's shadow was rebellion, the younger sister's answer was to do everything correctly. To be the daughter who caused no trouble, to make the right marriage, keep the right house, raise the right children, to earn through sheer propriety the belonging that beauty and scandal had not given her. In 1918, at the tail end of the war, Sonia Keppel came out into society as a debutante. She was 18, gentle and eager to please, and it was around this time that she met a young officer of the Coldstream Guards. A serious, somewhat sad-eyed man named Roland Cubitt. Heir to a barony and a considerable fortune, whose 3 elder brothers had all been killed in the war that had just ended. He had not been raised to inherit anything. He had become the heir only because the men ahead of him were dead, and he carried the weight of it visibly. He was suitable. He was solvent. He was, by every measure the age recognized, a good match. She had watched her mother command a king, and her sisters set fire to convention. Now the quiet daughter would try the respectable path. The wedding, the title, the settled life. She could not have known that respectability would cost her something too, and that the price would not come due for nearly 30 years. But first there was a wedding, and it would not go smoothly at all. The wedding and the marriage that followed. The 16th of November 1920. The Guards' Chapel at Wellington Barracks, London. By every outward measure, it was exactly the wedding a Keppel daughter should have. And it very nearly fell apart before it began. The bishop, who was to officiate, simply failed to appear. Guests filled the pews, the bride waited, and at the front of the chapel there was, for a terrible stretch of minutes, no one authorized to marry anyone. A substitute clergyman, a relation of the groom, as it happened, the vicar of Dorking, was found and pressed into service. Then Margot Asquith, the famously sharp-tongued wife of the former Prime Minister, arrived spectacularly late, and nearly overturned the proceedings a second time on her way to her seat. It reads now almost like an omen written by a novelist. A marriage that began with the man meant to bless it failing to arrive and had to be rescued by a substitute. But at the time it was simply a story to laugh about afterward. The wedding that survived despite everything. There had been a warning of another kind before the vows were ever spoken. Sonia's godmother was Mrs. Margaret Greville, one of the wealthiest and most formidable hostesses in England, mistress of the great estate at Polliston Lacey. She did not approve of the match, and she expressed her disapproval in a manner so imperious it has survived for a century. Mrs. Greville had herself driven in state to the Cubitt family seat at Denbies. There she summoned the groom's own father, Lord Ashcombe, master of the house, to come out and stand beside her carriage, so that she might inform him to his face that she did not consider his son good enough for her goddaughter. Then she was driven away again. There was a bitter little irony folded inside that grand gesture. Mrs. Greville, for all her millions, was by birth nobody at all. The illegitimate daughter of a brewer who had married and maneuvered her way to the top of society. A woman of no real lineage, informing an actual lord that his son was beneath a Keppel. The Edwardian world Sonia was raised in was like that. Obsessed with rank and quietly built on the pretense that nobody remembered where the money had come from. Sonia married her Roland regardless, and for a while it was the life she had chosen. The respectable one. The Cubitts were rich in the most solid English way. Their fortune had been built by Roland's great-grandfather, Thomas Cubitt, the master builder of the 19th century, the man who had raised whole districts of London out of the ground. The cream, white terraces of Belgravia and Pimlico were his. He had built the grand east front of Buckingham Palace, the face the crowd still gather to look at today. There is a quiet symmetry in it that no one at the wedding would have paused to notice. Sonia's mother had loved the man who lived inside that palace, and Sonia's husband descended from the man who built its facade. One family supplied the romance of the monarchy. The other supplied the bricks. Where Alice Keppel's world had been all charm and atmosphere, the Cubitts dealt in mortar and money that did not blush. For the next 2 decades, Sonia did precisely what was expected of her. She ran the houses, first in Surrey, later at Hall Place in Hampshire. She organized the shooting parties and the garden fetes and the charitable committees. She became the Honorable Mrs. Cubitt, a fixture of respectable county society, and she had 3 children, a daughter Rosalind, born in 1921, and 2 sons, Henry and Jeremy, in the years that followed. She had, in other words, achieved the thing she set out to achieve. The correct marriage, the settled house, the belonging. And somewhere in the long middle of it, the marriage went cold. We should be careful here, because the private truth of another couple's marriage is rarely ours to know. Some accounts point to the strains of Roland's business life, some to troubles closer to home. The honest answer is that the intimate reasons belong to them, and were not written down for us. What the record shows is quiet and undramatic, that by the 1940s, after more than 2 decades, the union of Sonia and Roland Cubitt had worn through, and that on the 4th of July 1947, they were divorced. The timing carried one final quiet cruelty. The divorce was made final in the summer of 1947. That autumn, only a few months later, Roland's father died, and Roland became the 3rd Baron Ashcombe. Had she remained his wife 1 season longer, Sonia Keppel would have become Baroness Ashcombe, a title of her own at the very last. Instead, the divorce came through first, and she missed it by a matter of weeks. She would live the rest of her life as she had begun it, beside a name that belonged to someone else, never quite carrying one of her own, and 1947 was not finished with her. That same crowded year, in a villa outside Florence, where they had gone to live out their last chapter, both her parents died within weeks of one another. Alice first in the September, George, unable or unwilling to go on without her, barely 2 months after. The great atmosphere of Sonia's childhood, the goddess among the orchids, was simply gone, carried off in a foreign country in the same season that ended her marriage. The girl who had done everything correctly, who had chosen propriety precisely because it promised to reward her, arrived at the far side of it all with less than she had entered with. No husband, no title, both parents dead in a matter of weeks, and a daughter growing up fast who would one day inherit far more than her mother's quiet manners. Writing herself back in, at 47, divorced and uncrowned, Sonia might have been forgiven for slipping entirely out of view. Instead, in the years that followed, she did something none of the brilliant women of her family had thought to do for her. She picked up a pen and she began to write herself down. She was in her late 50s when she sat down to do it. The marriage was over. The children were grown. Her parents were a decade in their Italian graves. The brilliant, unreachable woman who had filled every room of Sonia's childhood was gone and could no longer overshadow anything. And so, in the late 1950s, Sonia Keppel did the thing no one had ever done on her behalf. She wrote the story of her own life. She called it Edwardian Daughter. Consider what an act of quiet courage that title is. Not an Edwardian life, not a memoir. Edwardian Daughter. She defined herself even now by the relationship that had defined her. She was still on the cover of her own book, someone's daughter. But there is a difference this time, and it is everything. For the first time, she was the one holding the pen, the one deciding which scene survived, the one who chose where the light fell. All her life she had stood at the edge of the frame, watching other people be the picture. Now she picked up the frame herself and turned it and pointed it at the corner where the quiet child had always stood. And what she chose to preserve tells you who she was. She did not settle scores. She did not expose her mother or dwell on the scandal that the whole of England had gossiped about for half a century. There is barely a direct word in the book about what King truly was to the family. The affair sits just beneath the surface of the child's story, sensed but never stated. What she wrote instead was tender. The bread on the trouser leg, the scent of the flowers, the great terrifying aunts, the friendly servants, the lost boys of the war. She wrote her childhood as a child who had felt it, bewildering, golden, and gone. It was the memoir of a woman who had decided that love was more worth preserving than grievance, who had every reason to be bitter and chose instead to be gentle. Make do and mend. The phrase that had once sounded like a sentence of second best now reads in the light of that book almost like a philosophy. She had been handed a life at the margins, and rather than break it, she had quietly mended it into something she could hand on. The book found its readers. It went into a fourth printing within the year of its publication. A genuine, if modest, success. Reviewers found it charming, wry, and a little crowded with the names of forgotten aunts. One noted that its rich detail of Edwardian manners might be lost on readers who had not lived among them, but that anyone who loved that vanished world would treasure it. It was and remains one of the warmest first-hand windows we have into the England of Sonia's girlhood. 2 years later, in 1959, Sonia was appointed an officer of the Order of the British Empire, not for the memoir, but for years of unshowy service to the St. John Ambulance Brigade in Hampshire, where she had worked as a county nursing superintendent. It was the kind of steady, unglamorous good work that never makes a headline, and it was entirely in character that her honor came for being useful rather than for being brilliant. She was made a Dame of the Order of St. John as well. Small, real recognitions earned quietly in her own name at last. She would write 2 more books after that, both works of history about other women, other centuries. A study of 3 brothers at Havana, and a life of an 18th-century noblewoman, Lady Holland. The shy girl who had been told she could never equal her mother had become in her way an author with a small, genuine body of work. The only one of the Keppel women, besides her incandescent sister, to leave a shelf of her own behind. And here we must pause on the sister one last time. Violet had blazed through her life exactly as she promised she would. The affairs, the scandals, the novels written in 2 languages, the villa near Florence, the reputation as one of the great romantic outlaws of her generation. She had refused to be forgotten, and she was not. When people spoke of Alice Keppel's daughters, it was Violet they meant, and it is largely Violet they mean today. But Violet had no children. Her marriage had been a formality she openly despised. She left no descendants at all. All that fire and nothing carried forward from it but her books. It was the quiet sister, the one who did everything correctly, who made the dull, good marriage and raised them well-behaved children, whose line ran on. Sonia's daughter Rosalind was growing into a lovely young woman. She had been named Debutante of the Year in 1939 on the very eve of another war, and in 1946, she married a decorated cavalry officer named Bruce Shand, a genuine war hero, twice decorated for bravery, the kind of steady, good man Sonia might have wished for herself. And Rosalind, in the summer of 1947, that same crowded year of the divorce, the year both of Sonia's parents died, had just given birth to a daughter of her own. They named the baby Camilla. Nobody in that ordinary, respectable Shand household in the summer of 1947 could have known what they were looking at. Not the newly divorced grandmother, still adjusting to a life without a title. Not anyone. That the thread nobody had bothered to follow down from the mistress, past the overlooked daughter, through the beautiful granddaughter, was about to run somewhere no one would have dared to predict. The thread to the throne for most of her life. The story of Sonia Keppel had a simple shape, and everyone who told it agreed on the shape. She was the daughter in the middle, the bridge between 2 more interesting women. You mentioned her, if you mentioned her at all, on the way to someone else. That shape held until an afternoon in the summer of 1970 on a polo field at Windsor. Rosalind Shand's daughter, Sonia's granddaughter, the baby from that crowded summer of 1947, had grown into a young woman of 23. Warm, funny, wholly unpretentious, happier on a horse or in a muddy field than in any drawing room, with a low laugh that people remembered long after they had forgotten what she was laughing at. Her name was Camilla, and that summer, watching the polo at Windsor, she found herself in conversation with a young man she had not met before. He happened to be the heir to the throne. There is a story that has been told so many times it is almost worn smooth about what Camilla is supposed to have said to him that day. As the story goes, she nodded toward the tangled family history and remarked that her great-grandmother had been the mistress of his great-great-grandfather, and wondered lightly where that left the 2 of them. Whether the words were exactly those, we cannot prove, and we will not pretend to. Perhaps it happened just so. Perhaps it has been polished by 1,000 retellings. But the fact underneath the story is solid, and it is astonishing. When Camilla Shand met Charles, Prince of Wales, she carried in her own family the living memory of Alice Keppel and Edward VII. The king's mistress was her great-grandmother, which meant that Sonia, the overlooked one, the quiet one, the daughter history skipped, was the living hinge between those two royal romances, 70 years apart. Sit with the arithmetic of it for a moment. It was not Alice, the famous mother, who carried the Keppel blood forward to the throne. Alice was the scandal. But scandals do not always leave their hairs where you expect. It was not Violet, the brilliant sister, the one the world remembered and still remembers. She left no children at all. All that beauty, all that fire, all that fame, it ended with her on a shelf of novels in 2 languages. The line ran through the one nobody watched, through the shy, asthmatic girl in the nursery doorway, the one who looked like the old admiral, through the beautiful wife who missed her title by a matter of weeks. Sonia Keppel, who spent her whole life being told she was not the important one, turned out to be the single indispensable link because she was the only one through whom the story continued at all. The woman nobody thought to watch was, it turned out, the one holding everything together. She lived to see it begin. Sonia did not die until 1986. She was there through the 1970s, through her granddaughter's first hesitant romance with a prince, through the long complicated years that followed. She never saw a crown, and in her lifetime, no one imagined she ever would through Camilla. But she saw the thread pulled taut. She saw the granddaughter of a king's mistress grow close to a future king of England, and she, of all people, must have understood the strange symmetry of it. She had watched her mother love a king from the shadows, discreetly, in a house full of flowers. Now she watched her granddaughter draw near to one in the harsh light of the modern press. The same story turning over again a generation later in a world that no longer knew how to look away. But history had one more pattern in store for the Keppel women, and this one had nothing to do with kings. It began quietly in Sonia's own body. In her later years, her bones began to thin and fail, and her strong, upright frame began very slowly to curl in on itself. She grew frail in a particular cruel way, shrinking, stooping, folding downward year by year, until the tall woman who had run great houses could no longer stand straight in them. In August of 1986, after a long decline, Sonia Keppel died at the age of 86. The cause was osteoporosis, though in those days few people used the word, and fewer still understood what it truly did. At the time, it seemed simply the way that very old women sometimes end. Bent, diminished, worn down. Everyone assumed by nothing more than age. It did not seem yet like an inheritance. That understanding would come 8 years later, and it would come to her daughter, and it would fall finally to a 4th woman, the great-granddaughter, the one the whole world would one day come to know. To look at what had happened to the women before her, to give the thing a name, and to refuse at last to let it stay in the shadows. What she left behind in 1994, 8 years after Sonia was laid to rest, her daughter began to disappear the same way. Rosalind Shand, the debutante of the year, the beautiful daughter of the quiet daughter, fell ill with the same disease that had folded her mother downward. And this time there was a witness who would not stay silent about it. Rosalind's own daughter sat beside her through it and watched and remembered every detail. Years later, that daughter wrote it down for the whole country to read. Seeing someone you love die slowly in agony and knowing nothing about the disease that killed them is heartbreaking, she wrote. This was my mother. My mother was only 72. She described what the illness did. My family and I watched in horror as my mother shrunk in front of our eyes. She lost about 8 inches in height. She wrote, Ard became so bent she was unable to digest her food properly. Toward the end, Rosalind could not breathe without oxygen, could not cross her own garden, even with a frame to lean on. Her daughter believed in the end that the suffering became so complete that her mother simply lost the will to go on. 8 inches. It is such a small, exact human measurement of loss. The distance by which a proud woman is folded toward the ground before she goes. It had happened to Sonia in 1986. It happened to Rosalind in 1994. The same quiet subtraction, working its way down the female line of her family. From the mistress's daughter to the mistress's great-granddaughter's mother. And the woman who wrote those words, the woman who kept the vigil and remembered the 8 inches, was Camilla. She could have kept it private as her grandmother had kept so much private. Instead, she did the opposite. She made herself the patron and later the president of the National Osteoporosis Charity. Her very first patronage, taken up because she had watched 2 generations of her own women suffer a disease that no one would name. For nearly 30 years, she has lent her voice to the disease that took Sonia in silence, given a spokeswoman, at last in the form of a queen. Look now at the whole line of them. Alice, the mistress, who charmed a king and was banished from court the moment he died. Sonia, her daughter, who stood her whole life at the edge of the frame and made and mended a quiet life out of second place. Rosalind, the granddaughter, beautiful and lovely, folded down by the family illness at 72. And Camilla, the great-granddaughter, who carried all of them to a place none of them ever reached, and who turned the family's private griefs into public good. 4 women, 1 thread, running unbroken from a scented Edwardian bedroom, full of orchids, to the steps of a throne. Here is the strange truth at the center of it all. Sonia Keppel was born into the very heart of power. The daughter of the woman a king could not live without. And she spent her entire life just outside it, watching brilliance she was told she could not share. She was never the beauty, never the scandal, never the one the picture was taken for. History, when it troubled to look at her at all, looked past her towards someone brighter. And yet everything came through her. The whole line bends at the quiet one. Remove Alice from the story and there is still a family. Remove Violet and you lose only a legend. Remove Sonia and there is no Rosalind, no Camilla, no thread to the throne at all. The woman at the edge of the frame turned out to be the frame. There is one last image to leave you with. It is not the crown, and it is not the king on the nursery floor. It is a book published in 1958 by a divorced woman in her 50s who had been told all her life that she was not the important one. On its cover, 2 words she chose for herself. Edwardian daughter. She never got the title she married for. She never wore the crown her granddaughter would. But she gave herself the last word about her own life. And she signed it at last in her own hand.